Hi, Mikita. Welcome back to Rendering Unconscious. I'm so
Hi,
excited to
Vanessa.
talk about your new book, Guilty Creatures.
Me too. Thanks for having me.
As I told you, I read this book in one day.
Actually, a lot of people have been saying that, and that was my intention. That was my hope. That was my goal because there's sometimes I start reading a book and I just, especially if it's a really good true crime book, and I just can't stop reading. And that's exactly what I was hoping for, like fluency plus tension.
It's so good. I decided to read it on a Saturday morning and I didn't stop till Saturday night when it was over.
Had you heard of the case before, since you're a
I
Floridian?
hadn't, and it's pretty recent. I hadn't, but of course I love to read Florida stories, and I love that you're writing true crime as like a psychoanalyst because it brings such another dimension to the writing and the thinking that like a lot of people love true crime, but it's like another level of true crime when you get it from a psychoanalyst.
Yeah, and I'm not that interested in traditional true crime because it's just kind of binaries, like good people and bad people. And but when I heard about the story, it was the repression that interested me so much.
Absolutely. And I wanted to definitely bring that up. The way that you talk about people is like, yeah, so humane in that like these kinds of things can happen to anyone. Like these are people like every other person. And the way things occur and develop, they end up doing these quote unquote bad things. But like instead of like, yeah, othering people and being like, oh, they're just criminals, put them away, they're not like us.
That was my intention. Yeah, I
And
mean,
you
so
do that in
many.
all your books, I feel. You have Guilty Creatures, there was an unexplained death, and Couple Found Slain. Are those the three true crimes? Am I missing anything?
Yeah, yeah. I did a book called the Maximum Security Book Club where I worked with men in a maximum security prison. So I think partly that's where I started kind of understanding things from the other point of view, from the point of view of the defendant, and seeing that because you've committed a crime doesn't necessarily change your humanity, that people who have committed crimes, and sometimes horrible crimes, still have the same dignity and human feelings and responses, and in that book are as receptive to literature as anyone else. I mean, just because someone's in a prison doesn't mean they have bad taste, or they're not like they don't find literature accessible, or they're not even interested in classical literature. So I guess I sort of that's where I started thinking about the humanity and understanding the humanity of those who've been convicted of crimes. And I also do some work with sex offenders, and that also allows me to see, really stigmatized people from the other point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's such an important perspective to bring, to humanize everyone because yeah, so much of the discourse in like pop culture is so yeah, demonizing and othering and it's binary, the good versus evil kind of story, rhetoric.
Yeah, especially when it comes to victims, because it's really, and I think this book might get some criticism for that perspective, because it's very hard when you have a victim of a crime not to kind of make them into a martyr, especially in this case, if it's a long time since the crime occurred. People, after people are killed, they change in imaginations and they become distant, and their faults are kind of glossed over or ignored, and their own, you know, inadequacies and problems. It's seen as almost anathema to talk about victims in any way except in a sort of worshipful way. And of course, there's a reason for that. I mean, the victim is no longer there and the perpetrators are. So there's no one to sort of sympathize with. And of course, it's wrong to give all your sympathy for the perpetrator, but I'm sort of trying to right the balance and show that yes, people who, I mean, this is a horrible crime, but the people who committed it are worthy of curiosity. And I mean, I'm not obviously condoning the crime, but just thinking about how, I mean, there's a passage in the book where I say that I'm quoting in Maigret, I think, um, that it only takes a moment to become a murderer. Before that, you're an ordinary person,
Mhm.
and that most murders are committed for. There's another detective in the P.G. James novels called Adam Dalgliesh, and he has this theory that there are 4 motives for murder, all starting with L: love, lust, lucre, and loathing. And people assume that the most common is loathing, and he says no, the most dangerous emotion is love. And that's something that we've all experienced, intense love, intense jealousy, and those are the passions that most crimes come out of. So this crime, to me, I don't know if I should like summarize it or if the book
I
might
know.
come out.
I want to ask you some stuff, but I'm like, oh my God, I don't want to give away the end of this book. Maybe I'll have to ask you about it next time.
Well,
Ask about your previous book.
I don't mind talking about it briefly because there's so much already out there, like in the media. I think
Right. It
people
is a public
will,
case.
yeah, and there's already like been a couple of books about it and a disappeared documentary about it. So just briefly for people who haven't heard about it, it's set in Tallahassee, this very small Baptist community. There are 2 couples, Mike and Denise Williams, Brian and Kathy Winchester. They've been together since childhood, since preschool. They grew up together. They're in this very enclosed community. The 2 couples marry, and then they sort of start to break out of their Baptist upbringing and start to realize that like marriage isn't all it was cut out to be. And they start to like rebel in a much older stage than most people would do. They like become kind of teenagers. And Brian and Denise start to have an affair. And it's a very like sexy, sleazy affair with threesomes and strippers and fall in love and then sort of re-embrace the church, but then start to think about ways that they could be together. And rather than simply contemplating divorce like anyone else might do, for various reasons, they decide that murder is preferable to divorce. And the way that they rationalize it, which is the part of the story that really interests me, is that they see it as a religious act. Like instead of realizing they're going outside their religion, they stretch the religion to cover their desires and decide that this is a test. If God, because they feel so drawn to each other that God must want them to be together. So they decide to stage this, they call it an accident, where Brian pushes Mike into the water while they're duck hunting. Mike's waders will fill up with water. It's like one of those witch trials. Like if he drowns, he's a witch. If he doesn't, if Mike drowns, then God wants them to be together. If he doesn't drown, then God doesn't want them to be together. Of course, he drowns, or at least he's murdered. And then the part of the story that interests me is Brian and Denise marry and spend 16 years together with this murder on their hands. And my interest is, how do they rationalize it? How do they go to sleep every night? How do they go to church and pray? How does this murder affect them unconsciously? And the story ends when they actually turn on each other. So it's kind of like a classic noir story where this couple get away with the murder, but then the threat is from each other, not from the outside forces, from the police, or from their unconscious, actually their internal forces. And so the Brian kidnaps Denise, holds her up at gunpoint. Denise goes to the police. The police arrest Brian and charge him with armed kidnapping, and they ask for the maximum sentence. They're going to ask for a maximum sentence, a life sentence, actually. And so Brian turns and confesses, in exchange for that he won't be arrested for any or convicted for anything to do with Mike's murder. So he talks about, in this very dramatic confession, about what actually happened during the murder, that Mike didn't actually drown, he survived, and Brian had to shoot him and then bury the body. And it's a very kind of heartfelt and dramatic confession in the courtroom. And then again, Brian got 20 years for the crime. Denise got a longer sentence. And I'm also interested in that. Like, why does the female participant, who actually did not have anything to do with the physical committing of the crime, why is she punished and sex shamed as well for her part in that. So in some ways, yes, it's a lurid crime, and that's interesting and curious. But at the same time, it's the length of time that the couple held a secret. It's really about secrets and how the unconscious works, how people rationalize crime, and how in a religious community you can kind of rationalize it religiously, and how it sort of brings them together. And then the whole of that time that they were living together and married, it was almost like Macbeth. Well, it's pretty much exactly like Macbeth. They kind of hand the burden of guilt over to each other. So for a while, Denise is the guilty one, and she becomes really ascetic and joins this prison ministry and is very devoted to the church. And Brian's gets back into alcoholism, sex, and porn. And then the burden passes over for Brian for a while, and it's Brian who's feeling guilty, while Denise sort of spends all the time spending her money on her daughter, because there was a huge insurance payment as well, which Brian, who was an insurance man, sold her. So yeah, it is in some ways, it's a typical true crime story. There's a murder, and the murder is solved, but it's solved by the participants themselves, because they turn on each other.
Yeah.
So that's the basis of the story.
And that's exactly, okay, we have to talk about God. But also
Yeah.
that's the other thing I really wanted to ask you about. Is like, okay, his confession was so like a confession would be. It seems so real. So I do believe him. Like I tend to believe him, and his in his story, how he talks about how she seemed to start like erasing it and really putting the blame on him and erasing any of her part, or like it even happened, you know? And I've seen, you've seen people that go into this denial where they just like rewrite reality. So that all
Yeah.
seems like very real. However, how terrifying is it that you can actually go to prison for such a long time, longer than the person accusing you of being their accomplice, without actually having any physical evidence tying you to the crime? Like there's no
Yeah.
like DNA or anything that actually like ties you to
Yeah.
the crime. Like
Yeah.
that's terrifying, because what if he was just an abusive psycho man that like
Yeah.
wanted to fuck her over and like made up this elaborate story and was really charming, and now you're like going to prison, you
Yeah.
know?
And that's the defense's point of view, that Denise was seduced by the man who killed her previous husband, and was married and had child brought up by a murderer without her being aware of it. And like you say, there's no physical. I mean, this happened when the trial took place in 2018, and the crime took place in 2001. So it's like 17 years. And they were first of all, there's no, when they were having their affair and when the crime was committed, there's no like texting or GPS, or Brian had a cell phone, but he turned it off. No social media, no like Google searches in the way that a lot of murderers are tracked down and arrested and convicted these days. But also, because they were having an affair, they were very secretive, and they didn't keep ticket stubs, and they didn't keep mementos. And there's one or two things that, I guess, show they were having an affair, but nothing that shows that they murdered Mike. So everything is dependent on Brian's confession. And again, some people think that he's faking, that he's lying, that he's just like a sociopath and a really, really good liar. And what I think happened is that they decided, they made this conspiracy to kill Mike. But then Brian went to the lake, came back, Mike's body never appeared. People believed it was eaten by alligators. But Brian said that Denise did not know for the next 17 years what actually happened. She knew that Mike was dead. She knew that Brian had killed Mike. But after Mike failed the God test, after that, Brian was acting on his own agency. I mean, Denise wanted an accident to occur. And, implicitly, of course, she didn't expect him to survive the accident. But maybe she wouldn't have wanted him to be shot and buried in a shallow grave. I mean, there is even Brian said that Denise didn't actually know what happened. So if you believe that, her involvement is even less. I mean, maybe conspiracy to commit murder, but she may not have been closely involved in the details. In fact, she wasn't involved in the planning at all. But in the last chapter, I call the Eve factor, which is something that Denise, as a defense attorney, a phrase that he used about crimes like this. And there's lots of examples where it's a man and a woman who get together to murder the husband's wife or the wife's husband. And it's almost always the man who carries out the crime and commits the crime, but the woman is punished equally, if not more severely. And often she has very little to do with the actual details of the crime. So, and that's, yeah, it's happened. I mean, people are convicted on the strength of someone else's confession. But in this case, I think there was so much, it was so much more about like the opprobrium in the community, that Mike's mother had been searching for him and she'd never given up her quest. She'd been petitioning people, she'd been going to the police, she'd been talking to the press. There was a journalist called Jennifer Portman at the Tallahassee Democrat who also never gave up the quest. The cops never gave up the quest. So finding that Brian doing this deal, he's not being punished at all for the murder. Somebody has to be punished for it. You know, the community has to be, there has to be community reprisal for this murder. So it's more like a kind of communal witch burning almost, that someone has to bear the brunt of the responsibility. Someone has to be punished for the crime.
Yeah, it really seems that way. And it's, yeah, it's scary how much misogyny is so real. People really hate women, especially stepping out of line. And like you said, she gets slut shamed, whereas like the man doesn't, you know, it's like so typical. And we also have to talk about God, like how this belief in God can make people believe really crazy things.
Yeah, and also can inspire a crime. And Brian and Denise could not face the fact that they wanted to, they were going to commit murder. Being brought up in the Baptist faith, I mean, they'd already committed all these sins of adultery, and they were doing drugs and visiting strippers, and then they reacted to that and returned to the church. But the church is there all the time. And I did some research and I attended some Southern Baptist services and I talked to some Southern Baptists. And, you know, I should preface this by saying they were the most generous, polite, kind, loving people I've ever met. It's not individual Southern Baptists, it's the church, it's the institution, and the way that the institution fosters repression and breeds repression, as do other institutions, that once an institution gets to a certain size, it stops being about what it's purportedly about and starts being about itself, you know, maintaining itself and maintaining secrets. So the church, their religious commitment helped institute denial. And Kathy, Brian's wife, who became his ex-wife, turned police informant. And so you have all these really compelling phone calls that she recorded between herself and Brian. And they're just talking about these like ordinary domestic matters. And Brian's very worried that she's not using the right seat belts and car seat on his kid. And when you know, we know that Brian's a murderer, but there's this sort of mundane level of daily life that has to sort of go on. And you can see how the fact of his crime is not in the front of Brian's conscious at all. He doesn't go around thinking of himself as a murderer, as probably most murderers don't. And so there's this like mixture of the messianic and the mundane. And there was another point about Southern Baptism. Yeah, I guess that it seems in the end that Denise actually represses, I mean, really, truly starts to believe that she did not take part in this murder. For a while, Brian and Denise they'd get more and more suspicious of each other as time went on. They'd pass each other down before they talked about the murder. They'd take the batteries out of their cell phones. So they were starting to be very suspicious of one another. They became the threat, not the police or the outsiders. But it seemed that at the end, Brian's guilt grew greater and greater and greater until he could hardly bear it. And his confession was almost seemed like a relief, like his kidnapping almost seemed like self-sabotage. But then Denise starts to, you know, he'll talk to her about the crime and she won't answer questions and just say that she wasn't there that day. So can ordinary repression combined with denial combined with intense religious belief combine to create this situation where you actually don't believe anymore that you committed a murder.
Yeah, no, it's wild, but people definitely do that, and that's the other thing, like I said, you really show these are not like she's not some like mastermind sociopath harlot, you know what I mean? She's just like
Mm.
an ordinary woman, probably like average intelligence, average socioeconomic class, like she's probably just very average. And like people can convince themselves of anything or yeah, talk themselves out of things. People do
Yeah,
it all the time.
and there's so many interesting like twists and turns and manipulations and maneuvers of denial that they go through over the years. And there's a point where, you know, they're together, they're a couple, and then Brian is contemplating his divorcing his wife, Kathy. And both Brian and Denise try to prevent it, to prevent that divorce. I mean, they've murdered someone so they can be together. Why would Brian not want to be divorced? And I think there's this sense that like if you can just get divorced that easily without any problem, what have they done? You know, they've committed a murder to enable this act, which is actually, when it comes down to it, pretty simple and straightforward. And there isn't going to be all this communal and social opprobrium. And Kathy and Brian work out a custody agreement with that kid, and so it's like a reaction formation. You know, they're kind of rigidly against this crime, this act that they have committed a crime to avoid. So yeah, again, church plus the unconscious sort of makes everything much worse.
Yeah, and you're also so generous. My mom is from Birmingham, Alabama, and her whole family, including her, were Southern Baptists. And it's pretty intense.
Yeah.
You're so sweet and generous, but it's a pretty intense religion. Yeah, I had lots of weird experiences growing up.
But I mean, I find that most Southern Baptists are like, you know, hate the sin, love the sinner, at least in theory. Um, and again, the violent hatred of Denise at the end and the slut shaming, it's really interesting in the context of the Me Too movement as well, that when a woman has committed a terrible crime or is accused of a terrible crime, that Me Too stuff just isn't in the picture, you know.
Yeah, right out the window. How did you
Yeah.
find out about this case and get interested in it in the first place?
Well, I have this podcast called Forensic Transmissions where I'm just interested in audio and particularly court case audio in court cases. Like I'm not really interested in like the forensic details. And anyway, so I'm always watching TV and watching Law and Crime Network and looking for court cases where there's like a really interesting confession or like a back and forth, emotional back and forth between the prosecutor and a witness, for example. And I came across Brian's confession, and it's just the most like horrifying, gripping, terrifying story that I've ever heard. But his torment in the dock, you know, he's telling this story publicly for the first time. He's told it to investigators and prosecutors beforehand, but he's telling it in public for the first time in front of his father, in front of Denise, what he did 17 years ago, this horrifying crime. And he's 50 at the time when he's giving the confession. And it's kind of difficult to watch in some ways if you believe him, which I do, this man, grown tough man, like breaking down in tears and basically unearthing everything in his unconscious in public and confessing for the first time his sins and his blame. And so when I heard that, I actually watched the confession, and I just like had to know everything about this case because it was so I'd never actually knew anything about it before. But when I researched it, I found that most people, at least in Tallahassee, were aware of it, and those people who knew Brian and Denise were pretty suspicious of them right from the start. But again, I was sort of interested in how the community, like, yes, if everyone knew these people are committing murder, why are you going to church with them? Why are you letting them go about their business for 17 years? But the community was kind of stymied. The police really couldn't do anything because there was no evidence. Because Brian and Denise had not only been so careful in covering their tracks, but had also been because they pretty much believed it themselves. They had no compunction about going to church, about going to Bible classes, prison ministries. I mean, they showed no signs of shame or guilt or even ambivalence about their faith. So all of those things, I mean, I just found it a really compelling story. Also, I know we don't have that much more time, but also it was the resonances with classical literature and with noir that really interested me. I don't know if you've seen Double Indemnity, but it's like exactly the same story.
Love
Insurance
it.
man a wife convinces insurance man to kill his husband for the insurance policy, and then they get together and then they turn on each other. I mean, it's exactly the same story. And there's also hints and resonances with other noir, other James Cain stories, like The Postman Always Rings Twice. And then also, as I said, with classical literature, I mean, it's basically also the story of Macbeth and the Oresteia and other classical texts. So I know it sounds kind of, strange, but what I wanted to do was to find the poetry in this case, to look at it also from a literary point of view. And the reason I choose the title Guilty Creatures, it's a line from Hamlet where Hamlet, gets players to reenact the murder of his father, hoping that he will stimulate Claudius into the murderer into a sense of guilt and confession. So what he does is like reenact the murder in a sort of poetic form in order to bring out real emotions in real people. And that's kind of what I'm trying to do with this book. Like it's a sort of poetic restructuring of the crime, which didn't take place in this kind of the narrative way that I retell it, and I've restructured the elements to increase the tension and so on. But it's like a restructuring of the crime in order to reveal real things that go on in ordinary people's lives, like the way the role of repression and the role of denial in like everyone's marriages, and the way that we've all done things that we conceal and hopefully not murder, but manage not to think about things, especially that we wouldn't want our partner to know. And yeah, just the general way that people's minds work. It's like a blueprint writ large that we can see the ways that the unconscious works on this like huge scale. And when we see it in other people, like in the Hamlet case, I think we can recognize it more easily in ourselves.
Absolutely. And I think this is why people are reading it in one day. The story itself is really interesting and gripping, of course, but it's the way you tell the events and the way you tie it into film and the way you tie it into literature and the way you talk about the unconscious processes happening. It's because of your point of view and the telling of the story that I find it so compelling and why people can't put it down. I think that's absolutely true.
Yeah, and yeah, because in terms of research, the details of the crime were all out there. As I said, there's other books about it, there's documentaries about it, and all the material was available, like the court transcripts and the homicide file. So it was really I interviewed a few people, of course, but it's really a question of like, what do I do with there's this amazing material, what do I do with it? How do I restructure it? How do I bring out certain elements that may get swallowed up or obliterated if you use or in an ordinary narrative, in an ordinary true crime narrative? And I really wanted to bring out those elements, and I wanted to sort of really emphasize those elements. I wanted to call it something like Macbeth in Tallahassee, but the editorial team wanted to, and I resisted this, but they wanted to really emphasize like the Southern Baptist element, the Florida element, because it would appeal more to a wider community who might not be so interested in literature. And I think they're right now. Like that's
And
a
the
kind of savvy
cover,
decision.
come on, what a
Yeah,
great fit photo.
yeah, yeah.
It has everything.
Yeah, and it even has an alligator at the bottom there.
Yes, the alligator. Every
Yeah,
Florida story has to have an alligator.
that's right.
It's
Yeah,
just true because
the
it lives
alligator
on
is
the
the
edge.
punchline. Even though it is kind of like the MacGuffin, there aren't really any alligators in the story.
Yeah, they're fantasy. They're fantasy gators that did the
Yeah,
eating.
yeah,
But there is always an alligator involved if it's a Florida story.
yeah, there
That's
have
for
to be.
sure.
Yeah. And just one last point, I think that that's also to do with like repression in Florida. There's so many of these Florida cases come out, and there's lots of reasons for that. But one is like, the swampiness, the fact that there's no stones or hills or trees. Well, there's no, it
It's
tends to be kind of,
sinking.
yeah, yeah. The idea like everything that's repressed goes to Florida and sinks under the swamp. And there's like prehistoric creatures down there as well, but it has to return. It all returns in some form or another.
Yeah, there are many bodies dumped in the Everglades. That's just a fact.
Yeah, I'm sure.
That is just a fact. I also feel like there's like a whole genre of like Florida. It's like true crime, fiction, creative nonfiction. There's like a whole like genre of Florida stories that I'm getting more and more into. I have to, you don't have my novel, do you? I just put out a novel a couple of months ago, and if you don't have it, I'll send you a copy if you send me your address.
Oh yeah, I'd love to read. Is it Florida themed?
It's Florida. It's basically all stories of growing up in Florida using the cut up method to weave them together into this weird kind of psychedelic, psychoanalytic
Oh,
dreamscape
that sounds fascinating.
novel.
Yeah, I wish
I
I'd
think
had
you'll
that.
like it.
Yeah, I can't wait.
I'll send you a copy. Just send me your address. And I just have to say, the whole reason I do this podcast is because I want to show all the ways that psychoanalysis can be used, not just in the clinic, but all those ways too, but also in other ways. And this is such a great example of like ways you can apply psychoanalytic theory in really fun, engaging ways and yeah, tell an amazing story. I love it. And
Yeah.
I love all your books. I don't have the book club book, so I'm gonna have to get a copy of that one. I think I have
Okay,
all the
well,
other books. I mean, I know I
all
have
right,
all
well,
the other true crime books, but I think I have all your other books.
you send me your book and I'll send you that book.
Okay, we'll
All
trade.
right. All right.
Excellent. Well, I know you have to go, but it's been so good to see you.
And you, and thanks so
And
much for
please be
having me
in
and
touch
talking about the book.
anytime and have a great time with the book launch.
All
Okay,
right. Thanks so much for having me.
bye.
Bye.